At dawn, when the sky was still pale with the hush of morning, a fragile shape trembled inside the wooden rails of a weather-beaten corral. Dust rose with every uncertain shift of its legs, drifting like faint smoke around a body too thin, too weak, too disregarded to draw a bit of worth. The foal's ribs jutted out sharp as ridges, its coat dull and clotted with neglect, its ears flicking nervously toward the scattered voices that gathered beyond the rails. There was no warmth in those voices, only the low snickers of men and the dismissive murmurs of women pulling their children closer. The animal stood in silence, its head lowered, as if it had already accepted the sentence the world had placed upon it, unwanted. The auction yard in Dry Creek was no stranger to harsh exchanges. Here cattle and horses passed hands daily, lives turned into profit with the slam of a gavel. Jedediah Creighton, the auctioneer, leaned against the post, his jaw chewing tobacco with the steady rhythm of a man who had seen too much and cared for little beyond coin. His voice, coarse as gravel dragged across tin, called out the starting price for the foal. A pause followed, stretched long and uncomfortable. A cough, a shuffle of boots. No hands rose, no voices answered, only the sound of dust stirring in the hot wind. The foal's eyes, dark and uncertain, swept the crowd as if searching for a single kindness among them, but all it found were turned shoulders and thin smiles. One man muttered loud enough to be heard, "Not worth the hay it eats." Laughter erupted, short and sharp, the kind that cuts deeper than silence. Jed spat into the dirt and barked again for a bid, and he bid, his patience fraying. Still, the corral stayed quiet, except for the faint trembling of fragile legs trying to hold their ground. From a far side of the yard, leaning against the shadow of a wagon wheel, Elias Boone watched. He was not a man people looked to for company, nor one they greeted with open hands. Solitary, quiet, with hair gone to silver before its time and eyes that had seen too much horizon, he lived at the edge of town and carried himself with a distance folks did not dare to close. Yet his gaze fixed on the foal with a steadiness that no one else bothered to grant. The auctioneer, desperate to move along, dropped the price lower and lower until it was nothing more than an insult. Still silence. Still laughter. Elias shifted, his boots stirring the dirt beneath him, and lifted his hand with a motion so subtle it nearly went unnoticed. $1.50, his voice carried, low but certain. The crowd roared with fresh amusement, jeers flung toward the man as if he had confessed to madness. "Boone'll buy anything, even bones with skin," someone called. Another added, "Ought to pay him to take it." The laughter rose again, but Elias stood calm, unmoved, his hand steady in the air. Jed struck the gavel, relief plain on his face. "Sold," he barked, and with that, the foal's fate was sealed for better or worse. When Elias stepped into the corral, the foal flinched as though expecting a blow. Elias did not reach quickly. He stood first, letting the silence grow, then slowly extended his hand. The foal's nostrils quivered, breath shallow and fast, but did not bolt. Instead, it allowed the rope to be fastened loosely around its neck, uncertain yet willing, as though something in Elias' presence suggested patience rather than harm. The walk back to his ranch was not easy. The foal stumbled often, hooves dragging in the dust, body swaying with weakness. Elias never hurried it. Step by slow step, he matched its faltering pace, his hand firm on the rope, his voice breaking the silence only to murmur a quiet reassurance. "Steady now, just a little further." The plains stretched wide and empty, the sun climbing higher, but the man and the animal moved together, neither yielding, both bound by the shared determination to keep going. By the time they reached Elias land, the horizon had melted into dusk. His ranch was nothing grand, weather-scarred wood, fences patched with whatever lumber could be found, and the silence of years without company. He led the foal into a small pen where grass grew in thin patches, and a trough stood ready. The foal lowered its head, sniffed the water, then drank as though the act itself was a victory. Elias watched, a faint smile crossing the lines of his face, though he said nothing aloud. The nights that followed were not simple. The foal often collapsed too tired to stand, its body refusing the strength its spirit tried to summon. Elias knelt beside it, feeding softened oats from his hand, patient through every refusal. Sometimes he wondered if it would survive the week, if his choice had been nothing more than a fool's gesture against the ridicule of others. Yet each morning, the foal rose again, fragile but upright, and each morning Elias found himself quietly astonished. There were moments, small and near invisible, when trust began to bloom. One evening, after days of struggle, the foal stepped toward him instead of away. Its head brushed against his sleeve, tentative but real. Elias froze, feeling the fragile weight of that gesture, then slowly lifted his hand to its neck, the first true touch freely given. In that quiet, beneath a sky fading to indigo, something shifted. Two creatures, both carrying the weight of rejection, stood not as man and animal, but as companions in survival. Elias spoke softly, almost to himself. "Guess we're both unwanted, huh?" The foal's ears flicked, as though it heard and understood. From the ridges beyond the ranch, the town's laughter and scorn felt far away, yet Elias knew it would return the next time he set foot among them. Still, he felt less alone now. He had not bought a burden for $1.50. He had found a mirror of his own quiet struggle, a life worth guarding against a world too quick to discard what it does not value. As the first stars burned through the dusk, Elias leaned against the rail of the pen, watching the foal stand taller than it had that morning. Its thin chest rose and fell with effort, yet there was pride in the stance, a quiet defiance against the weakness that had defined it. Elias' eyes softened, his breath steadying with a sense of promise. He did not know what storms lay ahead, but he knew this much: they would face them together. And so, in the hush of nightfall, with only the sound of crickets in the grass, the story of a man and a rejected foal began, not with triumph, but with the fragile spark of survival, enough to carry them into the days yet to come. Summer pressed itself heavy upon Dry Creek, the air thick with dust and whispers. Word of Elias Boone's purchase had traveled quick as wildfire, fanned by gossiping tongues that needed little fuel. In the general store, men leaned against counters with smirks, remarking on the fool who had thrown good money at skin and bones. Women shook their heads, their pity sharpened by scorn. Yet when Elias walked through town, quiet and unflinching, their laughter did not pierce him as it once might have. His silence, heavy but resolute, seemed to shield him, though each word carried back like a burr sticking to his coat. Clara Mayfield, the storekeeper, watched from behind her counter with eyes that carried more softness than she wished to reveal. She had lived long enough in Dry Creek to know kindness was mistaken for weakness, and she guarded her heart carefully. Yet when Elias laid his coins upon her worn wooden counter, his hands rough but deliberate, she found herself asking, "That foal of yours, is it holding on?" The question slipped free before she could weigh it. Elias lifted his gaze, his expression unreadable, and answered with a slow nod. "Holding on," he said, his voice low, his tone carrying both fatigue and quiet pride. Clara thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, a fragile light pushing back against the shadows. Back at the ranch, the days unfolded in rhythm with the foal's struggle. It grew not in leaps, but in painstaking increments, each stumble less severe, each rise steadier than the last. Elias spent long evenings mending fences or hauling water, always with the foal at the edge of his vision. At first, the animal lingered in the shadows of the pen, hesitant, but gradually it shadowed his steps. It learned the cadence of his movements, the steady calm of his presence. Elias, though a man accustomed to silence, found himself speaking more than he ever had, words not meant to be answered, but meant to soothe, to tether the foal's trembling heart to something steady. Illness struck one bitter night when the winds carried a chill that cut deep. The foal lay sprawled in the straw, its sides heaving, sweat dampening its thin coat. Fear surged through Elias, sharp and unwelcome, yet he did not yield to panic. He stayed at its side, damp cloth pressed against its body, spooning softened feed to cracked lips. Hours bled into dawn, exhaustion gnawing at his bones, until at last the foal stirred with a faint whinny, its eyes opening with weary resilience. Relief struck Elias so powerfully he sat back against the pen rail, breath shuddering, eyes wet though no tears fell. It was during those nights that Clara began to appear. She brought herbs her mother had once sworn by, broth carried in glass jars wrapped with cloth, remedies that carried both memory and care. She never lingered long, aware of how easily tongues wagged, but in those brief visits she and Elias spoke in low tones. Their words were simple, yet beneath them grew a current unspoken. She would watch the way he stroked the foal's neck with infinite gentleness, and he would notice how her eyes softened when they rested on the creature fighting for its place in the world. Each left those moments altered in ways neither dared confess. As weeks slipped into months, the foal began to change. Its coat shone brighter beneath the sun, its legs carried it in halting runs across the small pasture. The clumsiness remained, but beneath it lay a strength that had not been visible before. Elias watched, leaning on a fence, a faint smile shaping his weathered face. He felt his own back straighten when he saw it, his own heart lighten with each awkward gallop. Clara, too, saw the transformation one evening when she arrived with a lantern in hand. The foal trotted toward Elias, nudging against his chest with the eagerness of trust fully formed. Clara whispered, her voice catching in the cool night air, "I reckon you've saved each other." But peace in the west never lingered long. The summer brought storms fierce enough to split the sky. One evening, clouds blackened the horizon, winds howled through the mesquite, and lightning tore across the plains. In the chaos, a section of Elias' fence gave way, and the foal, panicked by thunder, bolted into the night. Elias caught sight of its shadow fleeing against the flash of lightning. Without thought, he seized a rope, mounted no horse, but ran on foot, his body driven by something beyond reason. Rain poured in sheets, the ground slick with mud. He followed hoofprints cut deep into the earth until they led him to the riverbank, swollen and raging from the storm. The foal stood trapped, legs trembling at the edge of the current, unable to move forward, too afraid to retreat. The sight carved fear into Elias' chest sharper than any ridicule the town had ever thrown his way. He tied the rope to a sturdy tree, looped it around his waist, and stepped into the torrent. The water fought him with every stride, dragging at his legs, pulling him under, but Elias pressed forward. The foal cried out, eyes wide with terror, and Elias reached it, wrapping an arm around its slick body. With all his strength, he hauled against the river's fury, step by agonizing step, until at last they collapsed together on the muddy shore. Breathless, drenched, but alive. Elias lay on his back, the foal pressed against him, both shaking but unbroken. In that moment, as the storm thundered overhead, Elias felt not triumph, but something quieter, deeper, a confirmation that his faith had not been folly. When the storm passed and the dawn broke clear, the foal stood again in the yard, mud drying on its legs, but eyes brighter than ever before. Elias stood beside it, exhausted but filled with a pride that needed no audience. Still, word of the rescue trickled into town, carried by ranch hands who had seen the tracks, by whispers that grew into admiration reluctantly spoken. At the annual fair, Clara urged Elias to bring the foal. Reluctantly, he led it through the town square, where once jeers had filled the air. Now silence greeted them, a silence heavy with awe. The foal trotted beside him, no longer the frail shadow of rejection, but a creature of dignity and strength. Its coat gleamed in the sunlight, its head held high. Children stared with wide eyes, men removed their hats, women pressed hands to their mouths in wonder. Even Jedediah Creighton, who had once barked its price into near nothingness, muttered, half to himself, "Well, I'll be damned." Elias did not meet their eyes. He did not need their approval. It was enough to walk with the foal at his side, enough to feel Clara's quiet gaze upon him, filled not with pity, but with respect. As the fair unfolded around him, Elias felt a calm settle over his bones. He thought of that first day, the silence of rejection heavier than the gavel's strike, and how far both he and the foal had come. Some lives, he realized, are not defined by the weight of others' laughter, but by the resilience to keep rising, no matter how many times the world pushes them down. And so he walked on, the foal's steps steady beside his own, Clara's presence a quiet warmth at the edge of his vision. The past had not vanished, nor the scars of solitude, but something had shifted. He had not just saved a life, he had reclaimed his own. The fair's noise swelled, yet all Elias heard was the rhythm of hooves against earth, a promise of journeys yet to come. The days after the fair carried a stillness Elias Boone had not felt in years, as though the town itself paused to reconsider him. Where once there had been snickers and sideways glances, now there were nods, cautious but genuine, given when he passed on the dusty street. Some men even tipped their hats, though Elias knew well enough the fickle nature of admiration. Praise often burned as quick as dry grass in summer wind. Still, the change was felt, not only in the town, but in his own heart. For the first time, he did not walk beneath the weight of invisible stones, his back straightened not in defiance, but in ease. The foal, no longer frail but not yet grown, had become the center of his days. It followed him like a shadow, not out of fear but loyalty born from survival. Its strides had grown surer, its muscles shaping with the steady rhythm of life on the ranch. Elias had taken to calling it Ash, for the gray undertone of its coat, and for the fire he saw beneath its quiet demeanor, a fire that smoldered though the world had tried to snuff it out. When Elias called, Ash lifted its head with eager trust, ears flicking, eyes alert, as though the sound of his voice alone was enough to promise safety. Clara Mayfield had become a fixture too, though never in a way that seemed planned. Sometimes she brought supplies, other times simply stopped by on her way back from visiting neighbors. She lingered longer now, her presence woven into the air of the ranch like a familiar fragrance. Their conversations remained simple, whether cattle, the stubbornness of townsfolk, but between each word lay something unspoken, something fragile that both seemed hesitant to name. Elias found his silences gentler when she was near, his burdens lighter when she placed a jar of preserves on his table without a word of explanation. Yet with change came unease. Elias noticed it first in the way certain men watched him in town, eyes narrowing, voices lowering when he entered. Not all admired what had unfolded at the fair. For some, Elias' quiet victory stirred envy rather than respect. Jedediah Creighton, the auctioneer, was among them. He had made his living measuring worth in coin, declaring who was valuable and who was not. The sight of Elias leading Ash through the fair, pride unbought by gold, had gnawed at him in ways he could not mask. "Luck," he muttered to others, "pure damn luck. That foal won't last another winter." His words slithered through taverns and back alleys, a poison brewed from wounded pride. Elias felt the tension when he returned for supplies. One evening, as he tightened the cinch on his horse, he heard the laughter of men behind him, not the laughter of open mockery, but the sharper tone of contempt cloaked in jest. "Boone thinks he's some savior," one voice said. Another added, "All it takes is one storm more, and that foal's back in the dirt where it belonged." Elias did not turn, but his jaw tightened, and for the first time since the auction, he felt the sting of the town's malice pressing close again. Back on the ranch, he tried to push it aside, but Clara noticed. She found him one evening mending the fence with more force than patience, his hammer striking harder than necessary. "What burdens you now?" she asked gently, setting her basket on the rail. Elias hesitated, his shoulders heavy with words he seldom let free. "They'll never stop seeing me as a fool," he murmured at last. "Even when they smile, I hear their scorn behind it." Clara stepped closer, her hand brushing the wood near his own, not quite touching him, but near enough. "Then stop listening," she said simply. "Let Ash's steps speak louder than their tongues." Her words sank deep, not because of their poetry, but because of their truth. The season turned. Autumn painted the plains gold and crimson, the air sharpened with a chill that whispered of winter's approach. Ash had grown taller, stronger, though the memory of weakness never left Elias' mind. He trained the foal gently, never pushing too hard, teaching it to respond to reins, to trust the pressure of his hand. Each step was deliberate, each lesson slow, for Elias knew trust once broken could never be fully restored. Yet Ash met him with eagerness, as though it longed not just to survive, but to belong. One morning, however, a new trial came. Elias awoke to the sound of hoofbeats, not his own. Smoke rose on the horizon. Brush fires sparked by careless hunters or lightning strikes had swept across the land. The flames, carried by wind, licked dangerously close to the outskirts of his ranch. Panic spread through the cattle, and Ash, though braver now, stamped with fear. Elias worked quickly, driving the herd toward safer ground, his shouts swallowed by the roar of fire. Clara appeared, breathless, riding hard with news that the fire was spreading faster than expected. Together they worked, moving animals, securing what they could, their faces streaked with ash and sweat. In the chaos, Ash bolted again, this time toward the very ridge where fire pressed hardest. Elias' heart clenched, for the memory of the river storm still lingered, but he did not hesitate. He gave chase, weaving through smoke so thick it burned his lungs. The heat was suffocating, the air alive with sparks that stung his skin. Ahead, Ash stood cornered against a rocky slope, flames closing in from both sides. The foal neighed, a sound raw with terror. Elias pressed forward, shielding his face with his arm, and reached for the rope at his belt. The fire crackled like a living thing, fierce and unyielding, but Elias would not retreat. He moved to Ash's side, his voice low despite the chaos. "Easy, boy. I'm here. Just me and you." His tone carried the same steadiness it had that first day in the corral, the same patient promise of safety. Slowly, Ash stilled, ears flicking, trembling, but listening. Elias looped the rope, tugged gently, and with a surge of strength pulled the foal away from the encroaching fire. Step by agonizing step, they pushed through smoke and heat until at last the flames gave way to open air. When they emerged from a haze, Clara was waiting, eyes wide with relief, her own horse trembling beneath her. She dismounted, rushing to Elias' side. Ash pressed against him, its body quaking but alive, while Elias bent forward, catching his breath. Clara's hand found his arm, steadying him, and for the first time, neither pulled away. They stood together, the foal between them, framed by the dark plume of smoke behind. The fire left scars upon the land, but spared Elias' ranch. In town, stories spread of how he had led his animals through the blaze, of how the once rejected foal had come through fire and storm alike. Some still muttered, unwilling to admit respect, but others spoke of him with new regard. For Elias, the change mattered less than the quiet strength he felt each time Ash trotted beside him, each time Clara's presence lingered a little longer. As autumn deepened and the nights grew long, Elias found himself sitting on the porch with Ash grazing nearby and Clara sometimes sharing the silence. He thought of the journey, mockery, storm, fire, and how each trial had carved something deeper into him. He had not only proven the foal's worth, but discovered his own, shaped not by the world's scorn, but by the quiet endurance of trust and love. The road ahead was uncertain, but as the stars stretched wide above, Elias knew one truth with clarity. They had all been tempered by trial, and they were no longer unwanted. They were home. Winter settled over Dry Creek with a quiet weight, snow frosting the rooftops and wind singing through the empty boards of barns long forgotten. On the edge of town, Elias Boone's ranch stood weather-beaten but alive, its fences holding fast, its fields dusted white. Each morning he rose before the sun, breath clouding in the icy air as he tended to Ash, who had grown taller, his frame lean but strong, his coat darkened into a sheen that caught the light even in the dull gray of winter. The foal was no longer the trembling creature of ridicule. He was a presence, steady and resilient, carrying himself with a pride born from survival. Yet with this transformation came a new uncertainty, one Elias could not ignore. In town, talk had shifted again. Where once there had been laughter, then grudging admiration, now there were whispers of desire. Men who had mocked Elias at the auction now watched Ash with calculating eyes. A horse like that, they muttered, could fetch real coin. Jedediah Creighton's bitterness sharpened, his pride still raw from being proven wrong. He spoke in taverns, planting seeds of doubt and greed. Boone may think that foal's his, but such an animal belongs in the hands of men who can put it to proper use. Why should he keep what the town once cast off? These words spread like frost along window panes, subtle but creeping. Elias felt the shift each time he entered town. The smiles were different now, too wide, too eager. Offers began to trickle toward him, first in jest, then with serious weight. "Name your price, Boone," one rancher pressed, eyes fixed on Ash as though the horse were already his. Elias shook his head, his refusal quiet but firm. "Not for sale." Yet the pressure grew, and with it, a tension settled heavy over him, for he knew that men who saw only profit seldom stopped at words. Clara noticed the wear upon him. She came often now, bringing food for the cold nights, her presence less fleeting than before. One evening, she found him standing at the fence, Ash grazing close, the sky bruised with twilight. His face was lined with worry deeper than fatigue alone. "They want him," Elias said softly without turning. Clara stepped closer, the crunch of snow beneath her boots the only answer at first. Then she spoke with quiet certainty. "Ash isn't theirs to take. He's yours because you saw him when no one else would. Don't let them steal that truth." Her words steadied him, but even as he listened, he knew the battle would not be won with resolve alone. The test came sooner than expected. One moonless night, Elias woke to the restless sound of hooves striking the ground, a sharp cry cutting the stillness. He rose quickly, pulling on his coat, and stepped into the biting cold. In the faint glow of lantern light, he saw shadows moving near the corral, figures cloaked against the wind, ropes in hand. Ash thrashed within the pen, sensing danger, his body a blur of panic. Elias shouted, his voice splitting the dark. The intruders froze for an instant, then one vaulted the rail, rope swinging toward the foal's neck. Elias ran, the frozen earth hard beneath his boots. He swung his lantern high, the light scattering across the yard, and grabbed the nearest man's arm with a strength born not of rage, but of unyielding resolve. The struggle was brief but fierce. Fists met flesh, boots struck dirt, the sound sharp in the night air. Ash reared, his cry ringing like thunder, hooves pounding against the rail. The intruders, unprepared for Elias' fury, fled into the dark, their curses fading into the wind. Breathless, Elias stood within the corral, Ash pressed close against him, sides heaving. He laid a hand against the horse's neck, whispering the same steady words he had spoken since that first walk home. Easy now, safe now. The foal, though no longer so fragile, responded as he always had by leaning into the voice he trusted most. Elias remained there until the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, knowing the fight was not yet over, but certain that he would never yield what had been won. The incident spread quickly through town. Some condemned the thieves, others whispered that perhaps Elias should have sold the horse before trouble grew worse. But there were those quieter voices who spoke of respect for a man who had fought not for profit, but for loyalty. Clara, hearing the stories swirl in her store, felt pride burn in her chest, a pride that drew her closer still to Elias' side. Winter deepened, yet the bond between man and horse, and between Elias and Clara, grew warmer. In evenings by the fire, Clara would sit with him, silence settling comfortably between them, the kind of silence that spoke of trust rather than absence. She often watched him stroke the rough grain of wood or mend a worn bridle, his hand steady, his focus sure. There was a gentleness in him she had not seen in any man of Dry Creek, and she found herself leaning into it, not with declarations but with presence. An extra hour spent, a glance held longer than before. Elias, too, felt the shift. He spoke little of it, but each time Clara left, his gaze lingered on the empty doorway, and each time she returned, his chest eased with a quiet relief he could not deny. By the time spring broke, the snow melting into streams that ran swift and clear, Ash had grown into his strength fully. His strides were long, his body filled with vigor, his spirit tempered by the trials of storm, fire, and theft. Elias would often ride him across the open plains, the wind tugging at his coat, the horizon stretching wide. The townsfolk who glimpsed them from afar saw not a foolish man with a wasted purchase, but a partnership that defied scorn and envy alike. Ash was not a prize to be sold, nor a burden to be mocked. He was living proof that worth is not measured in coins or the judgment of crowds. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the land in gold, Elias returned to the ranch with Clara, waiting on the porch. Ash trotted into the corral, shaking his mane, strong and unbroken. Elias dismounted, his boots striking the earth with ease, and walked toward her. She met his eyes, and in that quiet, no words were needed. Everything, the ridicule endured, the battles fought, the nights of doubt, the moments of grace, had led to this stillness, this belonging. Elias reached for her hand, tentative but certain, and she did not pull away. Behind them, Ash lifted his head toward the horizon, as though sensing the road that stretched endlessly forward. The past, with all its scorn and struggle, no longer defined them. What lay ahead was unknown, but they would walk it together, man, woman, and horse bound not by chance but by choice, by faith, by a dignity earned through fire and storm. And as night settled over Dry Creek, Elias Boone felt the truth settle deep within him. Some lives are cast aside so the world can learn that redemption is found not in grandeur, but in the quiet act of seeing worth where others see none. Ash had been given away for nearly nothing, yet he had given back everything, a mirror of resilience, a bond that turned loneliness into belonging, a promise that even the most rejected can rise into their own light.